Hello, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Hello, Caribbean. Hello, world. Welcome to another edition of Page Turners Plus. It's been about a year since we've been on this journey of exploring Caribbean literature and the magic of it. And we thank you for joining us on this journey. Today, we have a really exciting new adventure to introduce you to. Miss Jasmine Sealy, the author of the last novel that we reviewed, The Island of Forgetting, is with us to have a conversation. Welcome, Jasmine.
Hi, thank you for having me.
All right. We have a lot to talk about today, and we don't have a lot of time to do it.
Mhm.
So let's just get into it. No, the characters in your novel are broadly based on Greek, Greek heroes and gods. But we've noticed that you appear to have turned Homer's story of Calypso on its head.
Mm.
Was that intentional?
Yes, very much so. The Greek mythology, particularly the very small section of the Odyssey where Odysseus spends time on an island with Calypso, was very much the heart of the novel. It was the inspiration for the novel. It's kind of where it all began. I was reading about that particular section of the Odyssey, and I just became fascinated by Calypso and the kind of image of this island temptress, seductress. And I just thought that there was something really interesting about that. And I started to draw the parallels between the way that Caribbean women, Black women generally, but Caribbean women specifically, are often exoticized and hypersexualized in the media and almost made to be a part of the tourism product itself, right? Like kind of sold as part of this paradise. And then because this is a Caribbean audience, I can actually bring this up. Other interviewers I never know what I'm talking about when I say this, but Kez the band, the Trini Soka artist, has a music video for their song Hello. And in it, it's a white man and he comes to Trinidad and he knocks back a rum and he ends up going through this magical portal where he ends up kind of in a dance basically. And there's this woman there, and in the credits of the music video she is called Calypso. So I just thought, okay, so other people in the Caribbean are also thinking about these interesting parallels. And then I started going down this rabbit hole of, oh, is calypso music, is the etymology the same? It isn't, but all of that was in my mind. And so that was kind of how it began. I wrote a short story, a 10-page short story just about Calypso and Odysseus, and telling that story from her point of view. I was greatly inspired by Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, who obviously that's a kind of retelling or a prequel to Jane Eyre, told from the perspective of the woman in the attic. And I've just always been kind of fascinated by the concept of the mad woman in the attic, and I want to give voice to her, like the woman scorned. What would the story look like if it was told from her point of view? So that was how it began. And then once I started digging into the Greek mythology, there was just so much there to work with, right? Like Calypso's father is Atlas in according to the Greek mythology, and Atlas is this burdened kind of character. He's a bit of a martyr, has the world on his shoulders. He's been punished to hold up the sky, and I just thought, okay, I could see a lot there, kind of generationally, how that is how a lot of kind of older Caribbean people have to kind of carry this burden, the legacy of colonialism, and there was just so much to work with thematically. So I had a lot of fun kind of building that world, using the Greek mythology as kind of the scaffolding around which to build the story.
Francine, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I have like, gosh, 10 follow-up questions just based on that one response, but I'm gonna stick with the characters, because you just touched on the fact that the characters do come from Greek mythology, and a lot of them are named directly, but you change some of the names. For instance, you have Z and Odie and Nautilus, and we're just wondering why you chose to, kind of change the names of those three characters specifically and not stick to the actual Greek names?
Yeah, that's a good question. At one point, I was actually considering changing all of the names away from the Greek entirely, because I thought, well, the Greek mythology was my inspiration, but this is a very unique story that it deviates from the original myth so greatly that do I really need to keep those names? But in the end, I decided to keep them while writing. And then by the time I was done with the first draft, I just was so attached to them that I couldn't imagine changing them. And I thought that they kind of worked because, well, that's the thing. Some of them worked well and some didn't, which is why I had to change some and not others. But I found that
Hmm.
certain names like Peony and Atlas, there's kind of older Caribbean names are often a bit strange. I think also to people not from the Caribbean, like you do kind of meet people who have kind of stranger names or they go by a middle name, which is very common in Barbados especially. And there was just something about it that kind of added a bit of a weight and a bit of a kind of a history and a richness to the book that I really, really appreciated. But at the same time, certain names were too Greek. Like Zeus is just, it conjures up so much for people. And I feel like that would overpower the story. So it was finding a balance, not to let the names kind of overpower the story in a way. And Calypso, Atlas, Cleone, those names didn't do that. But other names, yeah, Z and Odysseus, I just thought it kind of went a little bit too far out of the realm of contemporary reality to have somebody named Odysseus. Where I drew that line was very much my personal what sounded realistic or authentic to me. Yeah, it was just kind of to the ear what sounded right.
That's interesting because even when we were discussing the novel, we kept calling Zed Zeus because it was so
Yes,
clear. It was so clear to us
I
that
did
he
that
was
too
Zeus.
sometimes. Sometimes when I'm writing or discussing, I call him Zeus as well. So that's very much who he is. It was just kind of in the writing. These decisions, sometimes a lot of them get made without you even really being fully conscious that you're making them, right? That's just the way the character shows up on the page. And that was definitely the case with the names. But I definitely went through a phase where I was like, should I be even using these Greek names? Is it going to be distracting? But so far the reaction has been good. Some people either don't get the reference at all and they just read the book completely at face value as a contemporary Caribbean story. And then people who have an interest in that enjoy finding the Easter eggs and the little, tidbits that are sprinkled throughout that reference to Greek mythology. I think it kind of works on both levels.
I'm glad you said that. So I'm going to jump back in because I was telling a friend of mine who's like a really big reader about the book, and I mentioned, oh, it's based on Greek mythology, and she said, oh, well, that means if you don't understand Greek mythology, you won't enjoy it. I was like, absolutely not. You can just read it as a story, and it's wonderful. There's absolutely no need to know the
Mhm.
Greek mythology. It's a Caribbean story.
Yeah,
So
that's not
yeah.
the first time I've heard that. I've heard it has kind of put some readers off in the beginning because they weren't interested or not interested in Greek mythology. And I have to promise them, no, trust me, it's still a good read.
All right, Kesua, you can come in now.
Oh, thank you. I might just, Jasmine, thank you for being with us today. I'm so excited that we get to have this conversation with you.
Thank you.
You mentioned history, and I'm going to jump in from that kind of angle, really.
Please
So
do.
we know that the span of the novel is quite a long time span. It kind of harks back to the 1940s, but really starts in the 1960s, but references the 1950s, comes right up pretty much to the present day. Now, in my historian's hat, I'm like, what you're really covering is kind of contemporary Bajan history. Although I also think a lot of my read of it was that a lot of the kind of family dynamics are also kind of thinking about able you can in some ways the family's a proxy for the nation. It felt like when I was
Yes.
reading it, and you're asking
Yes.
some really big questions and saying some really big things. Um, I like that you said yes. I called that correctly. Thank you. Is that why you chose those years? And is there a particular interest that you have in that time period and the face of Barbados?
Sure. I mean, The boring answer is that I knew that I wanted the final section of the novel, Nautilus section, to take place in present day. And then it was a little bit of just doing some math and working backwards from there to calculating 17 years prior when he was born, 17 years prior to that, 22 years prior to that. And a lot of me recalculating the math all the time and realizing I'm off by a year. So the the kind of boring answer is, well, it was just logically moving backwards in time. But you're definitely right in that I do think that the 1960s in particular were a very, well, it was our independence era, right? Like Barbados gained independence from England in 1966. So that is a massive transition in Caribbean or in Barbadian history specifically. It was also when tourism really took off and kind of took over as our main industry. And so I just think that that's a really, really fascinating and interesting time. And it's also the time span kind of within my own family history that I know of. I don't know much about my grandparents, but I do know quite a lot. My father was born in 1962. So in terms of like the oral history that I could have from family and to draw on that inspiration, that era, kind of what it was like to grow up in the 60s and 70s, I had that at my fingertips that I could ask about. So it's kind of a mix of practical and also thematic reasoning. But I really, really enjoyed delving into that history, and I went really into it. I found and dug up old newspaper articles of like people visiting the Caribbean and writing travel logs about it to kind of get the details accurate about what the servers in the restaurants would wear, what kinds of outings the tourists would do at night. I read just these very fascinating kind of travel logs where obviously this is the 60s, and so they didn't really feel this need to dress up their tourism as politically correct, right? They were there almost doing ethnography, right? And they would write about observing the locals from their balcony on their hotel, and they would have street facing balconies where they would sit up there and just watch people go by. And it was almost like an anthropological exercise for a lot of these tourists, and I thought that was really interesting. So I incorporated a lot of that. That was really fun. I really enjoyed the historical fiction element of it.
Now that we're on the tourism question,
Mm-hmm.
well, our reading of the novel is that the novel criticizes Barbados's tourism model. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you see that there is any? I know that you're not. This is not your. You don't have expertise in this area, but as an artist, as a Bajan, do you believe that it is possible to reform the tourism model to something that feels less servile?
It's such a tough question for a lot of reasons. The first kind of caveat that comes to mind for me when I think about that question is that I'm speaking very much from a position of privilege in that I am not dependent on the tourism economy. I worked in tourism. I worked as a waitress when I was a teenager, but that is not my livelihood. It is the livelihood for the vast majority of people living and working in Barbados. Not the majority, but a big chunk. And so to sit back from Canada and say, oh, we need to do away with tourism, completely abolish it, establish a whole new system, revolt. I can't say that, because it isn't my livelihood. It's not putting food on my table. That being said, I do think that it is inherently a post-colonial system that is very, very, very much entrenched in the power dynamics of colonialism. And we have not really broken away from that and established the kind of tourism that benefits our nation first. I do think that there could be changes made to kind of put Caribbean people more at the forefront of our tourism. And I don't think that that is completely separate or not conducive to what tourists themselves want. I think tourism is changing and people are often looking for a more local experience. They're looking for a more sustainable experience. And I think that we could be working towards that. I don't think the answer is more resorts. I don't think the answer is tearing up even more of our coastline. And so I don't think that that's a sustainable approach either, because the reef are dying, the coastline is eroding. Like, people can get the beach if they just want to lounge around at a hotel and drink cocktails. They can get that for cheaper on other islands and other places around the world. So what are we really selling? And I think we need to think more strategically in the future about what kind of tourism we want. Can we completely break away from tourism? Probably not. Realistically, probably not. But I don't think that the tourism model of sun, sand, and sea is sustainable forever. Not only because of the colonial nature of it and the fact that I think that most of the newer generation of Bajan people are going to be much more resistant to that kind of servitude, but also from an environmental perspective, it's just not a sustainable model.
Francine, do you want to come in with another question?
Yeah, I want to get back to talking about Calypso. Um, I find it interesting that you said that that's basically where the story started with, you were very intrigued by the story of Calypso, and so you started off with the short story about that, because one of the things we noticed is that Calypso's section in the book is the biggest section, and we saw that as being that she's kind of like the hub, the hinge of the story. So, but one of the things that Calypso says in the book is that she describes being slut shamed because of
Mhm.
basically the way she lives her life. Do you believe that Caribbean communities need to have conversations about female sexuality, which was quite a big theme in the book, and in particular about slut shaming?
Yes, 100,000%. More so probably than anything else. That's the aspect of the book that I'm the most passionate about. I just think it's such an interesting kind of a strange dichotomy, because in many ways the Caribbean is a very sexual society. Like, if you look at our carnivals that crop over, like, they're the way that the music that we listen to, the way that we dance, sex and sexuality are such a prominent aspect of our culture.
Hmm.
And yet there is this repression and this demonization of particularly women's agency when it comes to their own sexuality. And it just, the hypocrisy of it really, really, really gets to me. I had friends growing up in school, in secondary school, 13, 14 years old, who were in relationships with the minibus drivers who were getting pregnant, and they were just shunned. But nobody was talking about the fact that when you walk through town in your school uniform, and often the men knew how old you were based on the kind of school uniform you were wearing, right? Because you
Hmm.
didn't change into skirt and button up shirt until fourth form. So I'm talking, you're still in your tunic, right? So you're clearly 13. And these men will follow you and will cuss at you if you ignore them and call you all kinds of names if you don't give them any attention. And yet the women are demonized, right? The girls are demonized. And until we can have, and I think the thing is that I think the instinct that people have when it comes to protecting young girls is to just say, well, let's just have this society that promotes church going and abstinence and morality. But I don't think that that has not worked. That hasn't worked for hundreds of years. It's not going to start working now. I think until you can have open and honest conversations about girls' desire, young female desire and sexual desire, then those girls are not going to feel empowered to make informed decisions about their own bodies. So it might sound like a catch-22 to more conservative ears to say, oh, if we don't want girls to get preyed on, we need to teach them about their own bodies and their own desire. But I genuinely think that that's the way it has to be. Like, the girls are going to get preyed on no matter what. And the less that they feel comfortable talking about their own desire and their own bodies, the more likely they are to get preyed on, if that makes sense. So it's something that I'm very, very, very passionate about.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense to me, because if we don't talk to the young girls about the sexuality and the fact that, what they're feeling is actually normal,
Mhm.
and they don't know anyone that they can actually go to and have these conversations with. When they're being bothered by the guys, it can lead to confusion, and if they have no
Exactly.
one to discuss it with, then they will just, fall into the trap, so to speak. So I
Exactly.
agree, it's very important that we have these
Exactly.
conversations.
And I've been told, like, other interviewers and reviewers have said that they felt very uncomfortable reading Calypso's section, and that there were times when they had to put the book down because just the decisions that she was making made them so uncomfortable. And that's good. It's good. Be uncomfortable. Like, she exists in a gray area where consent is very nebulous. Her relationship with Odie is supposed to make you uncomfortable. Relationships, the between young girls and much older men, particularly young Black girls and older white men, should make you uncomfortable. But that also doesn't mean that she had no agency, or that her own sexual desires were not a factor. Of course they were. We can't put these things, it's all a big mess, right? And I think we need to dive head first into that and stop pretending like young girls don't want to have sex. Like, but we need to figure out a way that they can do it safely and be empowered and not end up in these predatory relationships.
Calypso's story reminded me of my childhood, of my growing up, because I there was a girl in my school who was a Calypso, and we all, and I'm included, we all vilified her. So it was a very familiar story to me, and I'm very glad that you took the bull by the horns and forced us to look at ourselves and to re-examine how we judge other women just for being sexual beings, which we all are.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. It was obviously a scary topic to venture into because it is so thorny. And there were plenty of times when I was writing where I thought, oh, I really hope the reader doesn't think that I'm encouraging this, and there was often the little voice in my head saying, I should just write a little something so the reader knows, you know? But in the end, I thought, no, like, readers will understand. Readers will understand what I'm trying to say, and that ultimately I am critiquing an entire system that puts girls at risk. And
Yeah,
I'm not putting any of that on Calypso,
that
right?
was very clear.
That's good.
Kassoy, do you have anything you want to ask?
I'm still reflecting on the last things we said because I really liked that section. Because the big word that you said really early on when you talked about desire, because I think it's something that we often forget when we have this context, these conversations about female sexuality. And I think you're absolutely right that when girls don't know that they're supposed to desire someone or what desire even is, it does put them in positions of danger because they don't realize or don't understand or don't acknowledge their own feelings about the people that, as you say, are chasing them down the street. Um,
Mhm.
and we're expecting them to understand things that are a lot of the time beyond them. Like they always say that. What was that song from the 90s, which I'm showing my age about? The girls look so good, but their minds are not ready. And
Mm.
we don't help that when
Yeah,
we
I
are not
mean,
able
if
to
you
have these
think about
conversations.
the word force right, it's one of my favorite Caribbean words. Is that like a Caribbean, pan-Caribbean word, force right?
Yes,
Yep,
I love it.
yep.
And it's
definitely.
often flung at young women as an insult. Oh, she force right. She's force right. But who is the one picking the force right fruit? Like, again, it's from the whole perspective that we look at these things, right? And so Calypso is very much force right. Like, that is what the adults or the people around her would think. Oh, she's trying to grow up too fast. She's, you know,
But the
but
fact is that an adult woman who makes the sexual choices that Calypso makes would have the same kind of criticism. So I think it's
yes,
an attack
that's
on
true.
female
You're
sexuality.
very right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I actually
100%.
did have another question though, which was just picking up on what you said earlier on as well about these girls who are preyed upon are then shunned and the first character we meet in the novel, Iapetus, is very much a character who's shunned, who describes himself as being the kind of man that when he walks down the street, women clutch their purses.
Mhm.
And so it strikes me that throughout the novel, we are presented with the story of the underdog in some ways. And underdog is not the word I mean. I actually mean someone slightly more outcast or the people that we often, no pun intended, but forget, right?
Mm,
In the story of this nation coming into its own and this family moving into positions of power and wealth. The story isn't actually on the powerful and the wealthy. It's not about Cronus and Z. Actually, it's about the people that they leave behind, who they force
yes.
into positions of servility. Um, And I just wanted to know why you made that choice, because it's a very bold choice, and it's not something we always see in any type of novel. But it is a lineage of people that are pushed aside and turned away and ignored and frustrated and have their own desires frustrated. Sorry, you've heard the question.
This is the best kind of question, because it's the kind of question that makes me think differently about my own work. I love these questions. It's not something that I intentionally sat down to say, oh, I'm going to write a story about the people within this family who are shunned and who therefore are shunned by society. But it's very true. It's a very keen observation that, and again, kind of the way the family dynamic mirrors the societal dynamic, is the story focuses on the ways that we can ostracize people even within our own family, and that even within our own family there is this stratification sometimes of power. So yeah, that's I don't really know kind of what to say to answer the question, just like, other than yes. Like, that's a great observation. And I think it's just where the interest and the intrigue lies for me, yeah.
I guess I can reframe it into a question that's maybe easier to answer.
Yeah, go on.
Do you think that, or do you have any hopes that we'll look at each other differently and recognize that we probably should look for more egalitarian relationships in our families if we want to live in more egalitarian relationships in our societies?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so.
That's still a yes question.
No, I hope that that's something that readers take out of it. I mean, particularly when it comes to the relationships between parents and children. I think that definitely writing the book made me more empathetic towards my own parents. I think that it can be difficult to see each other within family structures as anything other than who we are in relation to each other. Like, I can't see my brother as anything other than my brother. But we are whole people that have complex histories that go beyond family. And I think sometimes we can kind of be blind to that. And you see that in the book, right? Like the way, especially in Calypso's section, the way she sees her mother, she sees her as this repressed, devout Catholic, hardworking, busy woman, and she sees her as the model of everything that herself, Calypso, does not want to be. But as the reader, we've seen Peony from a teenager. We know that she has desires and she had ambitions, and life and her own choices led to where she is now. Is she unhappy? I don't know. Calypso sees her as such, but that's fully Calypso's judgment, clouding that section. And I thought that was very intentional. I wanted the reader to almost know more about the characters than the characters did themselves, so that you can kind of get that dramatic irony of you as the reader just getting almost frustrated with Calypso, like, be nicer to your mother. Like, she's been through a lot, And then by the end of their section, not to spoil it too much for any readers who haven't read it yet, but there is a little bit of that recognition between them as they both, as Calypso confronts motherhood and seeing things more from her mother's perspective. And I do hope that maybe readers come away with a little bit more empathy for their own family members as well.
You addressed mental health very directly in the novel. Why was that important to you?
Yeah, it's quite funny, because I think at the time when I submitted the novel for publication and it got accepted, the mental health aspect was not as explicit. These were just families that were struggling with the family was struggling with these issues. And I was very reluctant to name it as mental health, because I didn't want it to be a novel that was about mental health. And it's quite funny, because that same struggle is one that Nautilus's character deals with. And it was something that I had to reckon with. And then that got reflected in the character as well, because I was just writing about dynamics that I recognize within my own family and within friends of my families. And it was only at some point quite late in the publication process, as I was working with an editor, that I said, okay, I need to stop being scared and stop tiptoeing around this and just name it for what it is. And I think that mirrors the way that we think about mental health in the Caribbean a lot of the time, that we don't want to name it for what it is, right? People aren't alcoholics, they just drink heavy, right? People aren't having a manic depressive episode, or they're not bipolar, they're just mad, right? And I think that that was definitely the case in my family, particularly in older generations. I mean, I had a great uncle who wandered the streets, and my family would almost joke about it. Oh yeah, Uncle so and so's been found up in St. Lucie, and someone had to call, and we had to go pick him up. And okay, but the man needed some help, you know. But that's just the way it is. And it was really interesting to confront that I still had those biases. Even as I was writing this novel that confronted these biases, I still had them within me. And I had to kind of then write that into the novel. So in Nautilus's section, there's a conversation that he has with his lover when he's in Toronto, where his lover kind of calls him out on some of the words that he's using to describe his mother and the struggles his mother faces. And Nautilus is confronted in that moment with the limits of his own vocabulary about how he hasn't had to talk about these things, and how uncomfortable it is to talk about them and confront them, and how acknowledging the truth of his mother's mental illness means acknowledging truths within himself, things about his childhood. And so it was I wrote that scene in quite late, like that in the editing process. That came later because that was me really reconciling with, okay, this is going to be a novel about mental illness and intergenerational trauma and how those two things are connected. And I can't shy away from that. But it was a process. I was also very, very reluctant.
Well, I was very pleased that you dealt with mental illness from the what we would view as, sort of commonplace, like the postpartum depression that Cleone suffered. Then it seemed to me that all of the members of this family were suffering from depression, one stage of depression or another. It seemed to me every single one of them was.
Yeah.
And then we have Angelo, when Nautilus meets Angelo, who has several complex mental health issues. So I was quite pleased that you dealt with it, so head on, because it's something we need. My view is that it's something we need to discuss as Caribbean people. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. It affects every single one of us.
100%. And it's so just interconnected with the trauma and the legacy of colonialism, and you can't really disentangle those two things, which is why I think often I know that I deal with this, and my fiance deals with this living in Canada as immigrants. And even if we do want to seek help and therapy, to find somebody who has all of that historical context to help is so difficult, because they really cannot disentangle those two things.
Yeah. Francine, would you like to ask another question?
Yeah, sure. Just following in, since we've kind of touched on family trauma. Um, does the novel suggest that the members of this family might have avoided or maybe even contained their traumas if they had engaged in honest and uncomfortable conversations? Because there was a lot of, people not telling anybody anything. Just look at the way that Calypso viewed her mother, as you mentioned, and we know differently than her. And like the stories weren't told, they didn't talk to each other.
Yeah, that's very much kind of the question that's at the heart of the novel is would, if these secrets were revealed, or if everybody was open and honest with each other, how would that have altered reality? We have no way of knowing, obviously. Just the same way we have no way of knowing the way our own lives would have been different had, we had different kinds of relationships with our parents or grandparents or what have you. Not to say that I think that these traumas would have magically disappeared if they'd all sat around the dinner table and had a heart to heart. I don't think that's the way trauma works. But I do distinctly remember having conversations with my own father where he revealed things that happened to him in his childhood. And it was like storm clouds clearing from my mind. Like, I just remember it was such a powerful moment for me, just over WhatsApp. And I'm reading and I'm because I would then be thinking back to things that he said to me, and ways that we interacted when I was a child and as a teenager, and when we used to battle. And it just made so much more sense. And it just gave me so much more insight into the way that he parented me because of the way he was parented. And yeah, it was such a watershed moment in our relationship. So I do think that it's powerful. I don't think that it can be overstated how powerful honesty, radical honesty with your own children can be. And I think that that's something that a lot of Caribbean parents just do not want to do. And
Mhm.
understandably, because they've been working, in the case of my family, like working to move past this trauma so that they can give their children a better life where they don't have to experience the things that they experience. So the last thing they want to be doing is opening up that can of worms and saying, well, look at all this mess. This is the mess that they're trying to move past it. So I understand the impulse, but I think that that then can just lead to a whole bunch of repression and secrets and lies and misunderstandings that could be avoided. So I think there is really something to be said for kind of radical honesty between family members, and it can be very powerful.
Kesela?
Yeah, I mean, the novel's title, The Island of Forgetting, speaks to that kind of unwillingness to engage with the past, but also I think without giving too much away, the encouragement to remember, which kind of is also important in the novel, at
Yeah,
the climax really is also the center of healing. Um, and the question I think is, do you think that you've talked about radical honesty? Do you think that it's possible on a national level in so much as a family level?
yeah,
Because that's those big questions that we have, genocide and colonialism and
hmm,
enslavement. Those are the traumas that at national level and at regional level we still struggle to kind of commemorate, discuss. Reparations is kind of on the agenda, on and off, on and off, on and off, always. But lots of the resistance to it comes from an unwillingness to remember.
yeah. I definitely think that, again, you can see the way that these kind of structures at the level of the family in the book are mirrored at the societal level or vice versa. And I think, yes, definitely. I think that it is possible and necessary to be having difficult conversations about colonialism and the ways that it's still entrenched in our education systems, in our parenting, in our laws. And I think that, I mean, you can see by the recent kind of departure of Barbados from the Commonwealth and becoming a republic. And our Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, said, we're no longer going to loiter on colonial premises. I mean, that's such a powerful statement to make on behalf of a nation. So I do think that we are shifting forward, but I do think that at the more personal household level, that there are conversations to be had. Um, and I think also just there's a lot of competition, particularly in Barbados, which is a very highly stratified society that is still very stratified along racial lines. And I think that's something that makes people very uncomfortable to talk about. And it's something that we were grappling with as a nation quite recently when a video was released of a white Bajan man using a racial epithet um, on video. And it opened up a lot of conversations about kind of the white Bajan society and culture and people sharing stories about interactions that they had in school and racist interactions that they had. But there was also still a massive, massive resistance. I mean, even talking to my own family, on the Black side, I'm biracial, but talking to my Black Bajan family about, about white Bajans and about that strange subculture of Barbados that we have. And there was such a resistance. No, a lot of them are great. Most of them are great. Most of them are very friendly. Like that was just one man. And it's like, well, no, it goes beyond the individual. There is a massive, massive problem that is at the root of our culture and our society, and that is that we are still living on a plantation system, and it's not acceptable. And we need to have those difficult conversations about why this small white minority have such a massive hold on the wealth and the power in our country, and we need to talk about that.
Yeah, I
But people
lived in
don't want to talk about
Martinique.
that. People do not want to talk about it at
It's
all.
interesting because I lived in Martinique for a few years, and you have a very similar thing where you have a kind of very visible, powerful minority.
Yeah. The
Um,
Becky.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, and people do talk about it, but they don't want to talk about it in detail. So, what does
Yeah.
it really mean?
Yeah.
That the kind of contemporary art exhibit in the country is run on a literal former plantation.
Yeah.
What does it mean in that context to kind of grapple with the present when the past is so unresolved? And why can we not move forward if the present is still choked by the
Yeah.
past?
I think it is happening incrementally. It's happening one difficult conversation at a time. It's happening kind of with small movements forward, like with the, changing to a republic. It's going to start happening with when we start kind of opening up our laws around, because we also, not to get too deep with it, but we need to start talking about like rampant homophobia and how that is tied to some kind of often very regressive forms of Christianity that still dominate our society, but that in itself has legacies and roots in colonialism, and no Caribbean person wants to confront the links between Christianity and colonialism. So it's complicated, but I do think that there is much more of a willingness among younger generations to have these conversations, and I do think that times are changing very slowly, but it's going to be painfully awkward.
You live primarily in Vancouver now, Jasmine. Do you expect that your work will continue to concentrate on the Caribbean, or do you think you may start writing about where you live? Write what you know.
Well, it's quite funny because so before I wrote the novel, I have written only short fiction, but I've written several short stories, many of which have been published. And all but one of those are based in Canada. So they're written from the immigrant perspective, and they deal more with themes of kind of culture shock, kind of home and away, microaggressions. So told very much from the landed immigrant in Canada, kind of thinking about Caribbean from afar. So it's quite funny, like when I think about that question, because that is actually more my wheelhouse, more where I've been residing creatively for my writing career. And so writing a story like that was set almost completely in Barbados was a shift for me. I think both. I think I'm always going to be drawn to stories of from both sides, but I definitely have more stories set in Barbados that, like, within me that I want to tell. I don't think I'll make a complete shift. But it is an interesting question about. I think it draws some interesting questions about who has the right to write about what. These are questions I ask myself all of the time. How long out of living in Barbados can I keep writing about Barbados? At what point do I have to say, okay, well, this is no longer my area? Does that point ever come? I don't know. These are interesting questions that I grapple with all of the time about my own point of view and my own positionality as an immigrant, as a biracial person, as somebody who grew up upper middle class. I think about these things all the time. They're very important, and I feel like you should think about them. If you're not thinking about them, then you're not really doing your job. So I do think about it, and we'll see we'll see what happens.
Thank you for that, Jasmine. We're running out of time, so we have to wrap up. No, the next time you see us, we'll be discussing Cassie P. Caribbean PI by Vincentian writer Cecil Brown. But before we leave, we're going to leave you with a little bit of a teaser. Jasmine is going to read from her novel, The Island of Forgetting. It's a pre-recorded excerpt that she's reading, so you won't see her dressed in a white sweater. Bye. All right. Until we see you next time.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. It's been a pleasure.
Thank
so
you,
much.
Jasmine. It's been wonderful.
Okay, I'm going to read from the beginning of Calypso's section. Calypso is a 17-year-old girl. She is the daughter of Atlas, who is the caretaker of the hotel, and she grew up living and working on the hotel grounds. And so we're just going to read from the opening of her section so that we can get to know her character a little bit. So this is part 2, Calypso, and the year is 2001. The rains begin in March, too soon. They swell the gullies inland, carrying silt and sewage to the coast. The eddies swirl with greenish foam. The sand smells like dying things. The gutters are flooded, and when the tourists arrive in buses and taxis, they have to leap over thick brown puddles. I stand under the eaves of the hotel bar and watch the drops land like tiny grenades on the sand. The tourists gather their books and towels and run for cover. We learned hurricane preparedness in school. We're taught how to shutter windows and avoid power lines downed by falling palm fronds. In primary school, they taught us a song. June, too soon. July, stand by. August, a must. September, remember. October, all over. A tune for the seasons. But here we are in March, and it's been raining for weeks. Half our bookings have been canceled. My mother says we're cursed. My mother blames every bad thing, even the weather, on my father's and my refusal to attend Mass. The girl is too idle, my mother says often. The devil makes work of idle hands. She's not wrong. I know I should be helping more with the hotel. I see how tired my parents are, how they fall into their bed each night, silent, facing the walls, too drained from a day of smiling at strangers to have anything left for each other. But this will not be my life. I know I'm destined for something beyond this place. The rain may be bad for business, but how can I fault the sky for letting go when I too am thick and full to bursting with repressed energy? I want to run along the beach, get soaked to the bone. I like to lie on my back in the sea and feel the cold rain hit my face. But my mother forbids it. Sea ants swarm when it rains, you will get bit, she says. Middle of the busy season, my father says, coming to stand beside me, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he can spot an end to the rain there, some invisible respite in the black clouds. Well, we'll be all right, I say, my hand on his shoulder. My father is built like a boulder, broad-backed, a wide, flat face like a rock, good for skimming. He never talks about it, but I sense the same restlessness in him that I feel in myself. Sometimes he will stop what he's doing in the middle of a task, simply drop his tools and walk away, as if he suddenly remembered somewhere else he's supposed to be. I never follow him when this happens, because I understand. Sometimes you just need to be anywhere other than where you are. Sometimes you need to walk away to remind yourself that you can. This is something my mother would never understand. I don't think she's ever run in the rain just to get wet. This difference is at the heart of every argument we've ever had.